This is eternal human spirit, where every story proves why humanity never breaks.
The verdict of the stars. The chamber of the Galactic Council was vast, filled with the glow of alien light, its walls carved from stone taken from dead worlds. High above the great hall hung banners of ancient empires, each one a symbol of power and survival. On this day, the banners seemed to hang heavier, as if the weight of judgment itself pressed down on them. Delegates of countless species filled the seats, their voices a low murmur of whispers. Some were insectoid with clicking jaws, some reptilian with scales that shimmered under the light. Others were tall and elegant, their movements graceful, but all of them carried the same expression when they spoke of humans. It was not respect, not even fear. It was dismissal. Humans cannot endure, hissed a counselor with a serpent-like body, his tongue flickering as if to taste the air. They are fragile, short-lived, violent, even among themselves. His words echoed across the hall, supported by nods from other species. They are a mistake of evolution, added another, her crystalline body glittering as she leaned forward. They break too easily. Their world was soft, their storms weak, their oceans kind. They are not built for the fire of the stars. One by one, the voices joined, weaving together like a chorus of condemnation. The council did not debate if humans should be left to grow. They debated only how long before humanity would collapse. On its own, some suggested decades, some said years, one even claimed months. At the center of the chamber, a single human representative stood silent. He was not a politician or a scholar. He was a soldier, a man named Commander Eric Hale. His uniform was worn, his scars visible, a reminder that he had lived through the wars that tore Earth apart. His hands were clenched behind his back, but his eyes never lowered. The aliens studied him as though he were already a relic, a fading ember that had no place in the vastness of space. Some sneered, others ignored him. For them, the verdict was already written. The human species will not survive the next age of stars, declared the Speaker of the Council, his voice deep and final. Their weakness will consume them. Their fire will fade. Their story will be forgotten. The chamber erupted in agreement, alien voices mixing into a single sound that drowned out everything else. It was the sound of a galaxy condemning a world, and yet, in that storm of voices, Eric Hale did not move. He stood like a stone, his gaze fixed not on the council, but on the banners above. He remembered the faces of his people, the hungry children in the colonies, the exhausted workers building shelters against the cold of alien worlds. He remembered their hands trembling from fear, but never letting go of the tools. He remembered their eyes, always burning with something the council could not see. The speaker turned his many eyes on Arik. "Do you wish to speak before the record is sealed?" he asked, though his tone carried the weight of mockery more than curiosity. Arik lifted his head. His voice was calm, but beneath it was iron. "You believe we cannot endure because you measure us by the strength of bone, by the thickness of skin, by the length of years," he said. "But endurance is not in the body, it is in the spirit, and our spirit does not break." The chamber grew restless. Some laughed, some hissed, some waved their claws in amusement. They called it pride, they called it arrogance. To them, his words were as fragile as the species he represented. But there were a few who did not laugh. A reptilian warlord leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He had seen humans fight in the outposts. He had seen them bleed, yet refused to fall. He said nothing, but in his silence there was no mockery, only curiosity. The speaker waved his many arms dismissively. "Words, nothing more," he said. "When the storms of the void tear through your colonies, when the hunger of the stars devours your people, your spirit will scatter like ash." Arik Hale did not argue. He simply bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in a promise. His silence was heavier than his words, and in that silence, a strange tension filled the hall, the council believed. It had ended humanity's claim to endurance, but for those who watched closely, the story was only beginning. As Arik turned to leave the chamber, he whispered words meant for no one but himself. "They think our fire will die. Let them believe it. One day they will see the truth." Outside the great hall, the stars burned as they always had, distant, cold, and eternal. But for humanity, a fire had been lit that no decree, no verdict, no empire could extinguish. It was quiet now, small and unseen, yet it was there, waiting, growing, and in time that fire would blaze across the galaxy, a light the Council would never forget. The broken colonies beyond the shining worlds of the Council, where wealth and power flowed like rivers, lay the forgotten edges of space. It was here that humanity had been pushed, forced to build their new homes among barren rocks and poisoned skies. The colonies of Earth's children were scattered across cold moons, burned planets, and ruins of stations abandoned by stronger empires. To the Council, these colonies were destined to fail. They believed humans could not survive the cruelty of these places. They believed each settlement would become a graveyard on the colony of Veyros 7. The winds never rested. They screamed. Through the valleys carrying sand sharp as blades, tearing through metal shelters and scarring the faces of those who dared to walk outside, food was scarce, water even more so. Radiation storms forced families to huddle underground for weeks. Children were born weak. Many never opened their eyes. The aliens whispered that Veyros 7 would fall within a season, but the humans did not leave. They dug deeper, built stronger shelters, and when they could not find food, they grew it in caves. Lit by stolen lights, on Ardent 3, the ground itself was alive with fire. Lava rivers carved through the landscape, and every breath tasted of smoke. Machines collapsed from the heat, crops withered, and alien raiders circled the skies waiting. For the moment, the humans would give up. But instead of surrender, the settlers carved tunnels into the volcanic stone, using the heat to power their machines. They grew stronger in the darkness, and the flame of their survival burned even brighter than the rivers of molten fire outside Yuntirn. The frozen moon of Thalen, storms buried entire villages under mountains of ice. The air was thin, and every journey across the surface was a gamble between life and death. Alien traders came once, offering supplies at impossible prices, laughing as they told the humans they would not last another winter. Yet the settlers endured. They built domes heated with machines held together by nothing more than wire and stubbornness. They cut tunnels beneath the ice and planted seeds in soil they carried from Earth. They shared warmth, food, and strength, and though many died, more lived than the Council had predicted. The galaxy thought these humans were breaking. The Council waited for news of their collapse, but instead the reports told another story. Villages rising again after storms, children surviving where none should, men and women refusing to surrender even when the sky itself seemed to fall on them. Among the colonies, tales began to spread, whispered from one settlement to another, stories of a mother who carried her child across the wasteland for 10 days without water, only to collapse at the gates of the next camp but live long enough to see her baby survive, stories of miners who trapped themselves beneath falling rock, but sang together in the darkness until they were freed. Stories of farmers who grew food from dead soil and shared it with strangers before feeding themselves. Each story was passed like a spark, and soon the sparks became flame. Humanity was no longer surviving because of the places they lived. They were surviving because of what lived inside them, a spirit the Council could not measure, a fire they could not extinguish. Still, the aliens laughed. Scouts reported humans wearing rags, fighting with broken weapons, building shelters from scrap metal and stone. They described them as pitiful, weak, desperate. But in their reports, hidden beneath the mockery, was something else. They spoke. of eyes that did not lower, of hands that did not release their tools, of voices that never stopped planning the next day even when the last one had nearly killed them. One alien warlord, after raiding a settlement on Thalen, found himself unsettled. He had burned their fields, shattered their machines, and left them with almost nothing. Yet when he returned months later, the humans had rebuilt. Their domes stood taller, their fields wider, their machines louder. When he demanded to know how they had survived, a scarred farmer only said, "We do not ask how to survive. We ask how not to die." The warlord could not understand the difference, and so he left. Shaken, Commander Arik Hale, far from the Council's chamber, traveled among these colonies. He walked through the ash of Ardent 3, the storms of Veyros 7, the ice of Thalen. Everywhere he went, he saw suffering. But he also saw the fire that no alien believed could last. He carried their stories with him, each one proof that the Council's verdict was a lie, and in the deep nights, when the stars burned cold above the colonies, the humans lit fires not, only for warmth, but for memory. Flames that told them they were still alive, still fighting, still enduring. The aliens called them fragile. But the fires whispered another truth. Humanity was not breaking. Humanity was becoming something the galaxy had never seen before. The Council had given its verdict, but the colonies were writing their own. And with every flame lit in the darkness, with every child born in the wastelands, with every life pulled back from the edge of death, that verdict grew stronger, louder, impossible to ignore. The broken colonies were not broken at all. They were alive, and their fire was only beginning to rise, the spark of defiance. The colonies had endured storms, hunger, fire, and ice, yet endurance alone was never enough. To survive was a victory, but to survive without defiance meant the galaxy would always look at humans as broken creatures clinging to scraps of life. Humanity needed more than fires for warmth. They needed fire for resistance. It began not in a grand hall, not on a battlefield, but in the shadow of a ruined station orbiting a forgotten world. A young engineer named Lyra Kale sat among piles of broken machines. She was not a soldier. She was not a leader. She was simply a girl who had grown tired of watching her people hide. Her hands were blistered, her eyes weary from sleepless nights, but her mind burned with ideas. She scavenged wires, metal, scraps of alien tech left behind by raiders, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to build something no one thought possible. E.T. First weapon she created was small, a cannon carved out of mining equipment, its barrel lined with stolen crystal shards. The settlers laughed at first, telling her it would explode in her hands, but when the raiders came again, the cannon fired, a blast that cut through alien armor. The settlement survived, and the laughter turned into silence. Then silence turned into whispers, and whispers into stories. "Did you hear what happened on the station above Cryos?" one miner whispered. A girl turned rocks into fire, and the raiders fled. Others shook their heads, but the story spread, and with each telling the fire grew brighter. Soon other engineers followed her example. They took apart old ships, stripped down broken machines, and turned waste into weapons. What began as survival shifted into resistance. The galaxy thought humans were desperate, but desperation was the mother of defiance, and defiance was the spark that lit the fire. Aliens noticed. Reports reached the Council of raids being repelled, not by professional soldiers but by colonists wielding strange weapons no one had seen before. The Council dismissed these as accidents, anomalies. They claimed the raiders were weak, the battles small. But in private, some of them whispered, "What if it is more Commander Arik Hale, still traveling among the colonies, saw this spark with his own eyes?" He stood beside Lyra as her weapon fired again, watching the flash of light tear through the armor of an alien ship. He saw the fear in the eyes of the raiders as they retreated. He saw the hope in the faces of the colonists as they realized they were not helpless anymore. That night, Arik spoke to the people gathered around the fire. His voice carried not only the weight of his scars, but the promise of something greater. "The Council believes we are weak," he said. "They think we can only hide. They think endurance is the most we are capable of. But today, you proved them wrong. Today, you showed them that fire is not only for survival, fire is for defiance." The crowd did not cheer loudly, they did not roar. Instead, they sat in silence, and in that silence was power. The kind of power that grows slowly but never fades. Colonies began to change. No longer were they simply surviving storms and hunger. Now they were preparing. Weapons appeared in hidden caves, in barns, in mines. Each one looked crude, unfinished, but each one carried the spirit of the people. Who built it? The settlers no longer waited for raiders to come. They went out into the darkness, striking first, taking supplies, saving neighbors from distant colonies. Stories spread across the stars, whispered even among alien fleets, a convoy ambushed by colonists with fire spears made from scrap, a raider, captain fleeing from a single human woman who carried a weapon made from a broken engine, children standing guard with slingshot-like weapons that fired shards sharp enough to pierce armor. Each story was a spark, and the sparks were turning into a blaze. The Council tried to silence the reports, but truth has a way of surviving. The galaxy began to see humans not as fragile creatures but as unpredictable fire, a fire that grew brighter. The more it was pressed down, among the aliens, fear began to creep in. A reptilian commander who once laughed at human weakness now watched his soldiers refuse to raid certain colonies. They whispered that humans carried a madness, a refusal to die that turned broken tools into weapons. Some called it luck, others called it insanity. But deep down, they began to realize it was something else entirely. It was spirit. Lyra Kale became a name carried across settlements like a legend, not because she was the strongest, not because she was the smartest, but because she dared to say no when everyone else whispered yes to fate. She had defied the verdict of the stars, and through her, humanity had found its spark. As months turned to years, the colonies no longer felt like graves. They felt like camps before a war. Every fire lit in the night was no longer just warmth against the cold. It was a signal, a message, a reminder to the galaxy that humanity was not done. The Council still declared humans weak, but their words no longer echoed as strongly, because for every speech of condemnation, there was a battle won in the shadows. For every alien who sneered, there was a story of a human who refused to bow, and in the dark corners of the galaxy, far from the great halls of power, the spark of defiance spread, growing hotter, brighter, unstoppable. Humanity was no longer only enduring. Humanity was preparing to rise, the child in the ashes. The fires of defiance had begun to spread, yet the galaxy still believed they could be stamped out. The alien warlords sent raiding parties, fleets of mercenaries and soldiers to remind the colonies of their weakness. They thought humans would return to hiding, to silence, to endurance without resistance. But what they found instead was something that no empire could have predicted, something born not from weapons or soldiers, but from the smallest spark imaginable. On the ruined world of Raylos 9, the war had already burned everything. Cities, once filled with human laughter, were reduced to bones of stone and steel. Smoke still curled from craters where bombs had fallen years before. The few survivors lived like shadows, moving through rubble to avoid patrols, gathering scraps to keep children alive. It was here that a story began which would spread further and faster than any raid. An alien warlord named Veyron, tall and armored in plates of black metal, marched through the ruins with his soldiers. He had come not to fight, but to count the last breaths of humans before the planet was left for dead. His soldiers mocked the broken buildings, crushing what little remained with their boots. They laughed as they tore down makeshift shelters. They expected silence, despair, surrender. But as Veyron pushed deeper into the ruins, his soldiers fell into a strange quiet. There, in the center of a burned village, stood a child, a girl no older than 7 years. Her clothes were rags, her face smudged with ash, yet in her small hands she held a torch lit from scraps of oil and cloth. The flame flickered weakly against the darkness, but she held it as if it were brighter than the stars. Veyron stopped. For a moment, he thought it must be a trick, a trap set by desperate survivors. He raised his weapon, but the girl did not flinch. Her eyes locked with his, steady, unblinking, unafraid. Around her the world was ash, but within her gaze there was fire. His soldiers sneered, shouting at the girl, mocking her courage, telling her to drop the torch and run. But the child's voice rose above them, soft yet clear. "We are still here," she whispered. Her words were not a shout, not a threat, but they carried like thunder through the ruins. For the first time in years, the warlord hesitated. He had crushed armies, burned cities, broken warriors, but never had he been shaken by a child. Something about the way she stood, the way she refused to bow, the way the fire trembled but never went out, it unsettled him. He lowered his weapon slightly, unable to understand the weight of the moment. The soldiers around him laughed nervously, telling him to finish it, telling him she was nothing. But when he looked into her eyes, Veyron saw not weakness, not fragility, but something far more dangerous. He saw defiance that could not be killed, a fire that no blade or bullet could extinguish. He turned away, ordering his soldiers to move on. They protested, but he silenced them with a single command. The girl watched them leave, her torch still burning. Her body shook with exhaustion. Her knees nearly buckled, but she did not let the flame die. And in the shadows, other survivors saw her, inspired by her courage. They whispered her words, "We are still here," and repeated them like a prayer. Soon, the story spread beyond Raylos 9. Traders carried it to other colonies. Soldiers told it in hushed voices. Raiders repeated it with unease. Across the galaxy, humans spoke of the child in the ashes, a symbol not of strength or weapons, but of spirit. Commander Arik Hale heard the story when he reached the outer colonies. At first, he did not believe it, for it sounded too much like a legend. Yet, when he arrived at Raylos 9, he saw the torch himself, preserved by the survivors who had built a shrine around it. They told him of the girl, of her words, of the silence that had shaken the warlord. Arik bowed his head before the flame, understanding that this child had done more than any soldier could. She had turned survival into defiance, and defiance into hope. The council tried to dismiss the tale as human propaganda. They claimed no child could shake a warlord. They said the story was exaggerated. But deep inside their grand chamber, some of the older species exchanged worried glances. They knew the truth of symbols. They knew that armies may fall, but symbols lived forever, and this child had become one. Among the colonies, people began to light torches at night, not for warmth, not for light, but as a message. Flames burned on the rooftops of shelters, along the walls of domes, across the wastelands of frozen moons. Each flame whispered the same words, "We are still here." Even the warlord Veyron found himself haunted by the memory. He dreamed of the child's eyes, of the flame that would not go out. He told no one, but deep in his heart, he feared that the fire he had seen in her was the same fire that might one day burn across the galaxy. And he was right. The child had not only survived, she had lit a fire that could never be forgotten, a fire that would spread through every colony, every ship, every heart, until the stars themselves carried the message. Humanity was not gone. Humanity would never be gone. Humanity was still here, and humanity would endure. The Firestorm. Awakens, the story of the child in the ashes did not fade. It spread like wildfire across the scattered colonies, carried by traders, by refugees, By whispers in the night, everywhere humans gathered, they repeated her words. "We are still here," and each time the words were spoken, the fire inside them grew. The council still mocked, the empires still dismissed humanity as weak. But in the shadows of the galaxy, something new was taking shape, something no decree of the council could contain. The scattered sparks of defiance began to gather. Colonists who once fought only to defend their homes now looked to the stars and thought of striking back. They had endured. They had resisted. But now they were ready to ignite. Hidden in the ruins of old stations and in the depths of mining tunnels, they began to build. Not only shelters, not only crude weapons, but ships. Ships unlike any the galaxy had seen before. These were not. Warships crafted by great empires, polished and perfected by engineers in shining towers. These were ships born from desperation and courage, their hulls built from wreckage, their engines powered by scavenged parts. Each one bore scars even before it flew, but each one carried the heart of a people who refused to bow. They called them the Torch Fleet, for each ship burned with the fire of survival turned into defiance. Commander Arik Hale became the voice of this rising storm. He traveled from colony to colony, speaking not with promises of glory but with reminders of truth. He told them of Veyros 7, where storms could not kill, of Ardent 3, where fire became strength, of Thalen, where ice could not bury hope, of Raylos 9, where a child had faced a warlord. Without fear, he told them these were not stories of survival. They were proof. Proof that humanity's fire could burn through anything. His words were quiet, steady, unshaken, but in their calmness there was power, a power that drew people to him. The first strike came at the edge of the Ardent Rim, where a convoy of alien raiders prepared to attack a human settlement. Instead of finding helpless colonists, they found ships emerging from the darkness, battered but relentless. The Torch Fleet descended upon them with weapons cobbled together from mining lasers, plasma torches, and explosives hidden inside fuel tanks. The battle was chaotic, brutal, and unlike anything the raiders had ever seen. For every human ship destroyed, 2 more pressed forward, and for every explosion that tore through the fleet. The flames only seemed to grow brighter. The raiders fled, humiliated, leaving behind wreckage that humans quickly salvaged to strengthen their fleet. For the first time, a human victory was not defense but offense. For the first time, the galaxy saw humans not as prey but as fire. News spread faster than light. The council tried to hide it, but too many eyes had seen. Too many voices had carried the story. Colonists across the galaxy lit torches in the night to celebrate. Children chanted the words of the girl from Raylos 9. Soldiers whispered that perhaps humanity was not a dying ember but a rising flame. The Torch Fleet struck again and again, never staying in one place, always moving, always burning. They attacked supply lines, freed captured colonies, and destroyed stations thought to be untouchable. Aliens began to fear the sight of a flicker, of light in the void, for they knew it might be humans coming to ignite their destruction. But these victories came with cost. Every battle left ships burning. Every strike took lives. Humanity bled with every step forward. And yet, the fire did not weaken. The more they lost, the more determined they became, because every death was another spark feeding the flame. The council convened again, their chamber filled with unease. They spoke of extinguishing humanity once and for all, sending fleets large enough to crush them. Some argued that humanity was still too weak, that their victories were accidents. But others whispered of the danger of letting the fire spread further. For the first time, fear crept into the voices of the mighty. Among the colonies, hope was no longer fragile. It was a weapon. Every torch lit at night was a promise. Every ship launched into the void was a warning. Humanity had endured storms, hunger, fire, and ice. They had turned survival into defiance, and now defiance into war. On one night, deep in the void, Arik Hale stood on the bridge of his ship, gazing out at the scattered fleet. They were battered, scarred, incomplete. Yet, as he watched their lights flicker in the darkness, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt destiny. He knew the Council could send fleets, empires could send armies, but nothing in the galaxy could kill what had been born here. He turned to his crew, his voice calm but burning. They thought we would fade. They thought our fire would die. But we have shown them the truth. We are not fading. We are rising. And our firestorm has only begun. And across the void, in every colony, in every ship, in every heart, the firestorm awakened, unstoppable, unforgettable, the trial of survival. The firestorm had spread, and the galaxy could no longer ignore it. For too long the Council had dismissed humanity as fragile. For too long the empires had laughed at the idea of humans standing among the stars. But now, their laughter had turned into whispers of unease, and unease soon hardened into fear. Humanity had risen from ashes, turned scraps into ships, turned weakness into defiance, and now the galaxy prepared to test whether that fire could truly endure against the storms yet to come. The alien empires gathered fleets the size of worlds, gleaming warships lined with weapons forged from centuries of conquest. They believed that sheer force could crush the humans, that overwhelming numbers could drown their fire in the grand chamber of the Council, the speaker declared. This defiance must end. Humanity must be broken. Their fire must be extinguished before it spreads. His words were met with agreement, for the other empires could not risk such rebellion inspiring their own subjects, and so the trial began. Across the stars, human colonies and the Torch Fleet faced their greatest storm. On the edge of the Andros Belt, the first great battle erupted. The sky burned as fleets collided, alien cruisers unleashing storms of plasma and metal, while human ships, battered and improvised, danced between them with reckless courage. For every ship lost, another surged forward, and though entire hulls were torn apart, humanity refused to retreat. Commander Arik Hale stood at the heart of it, his ship scarred, his crew exhausted, yet his eyes burned with calm fury. He gave no grand speeches, no promises of victory, only steady commands. His presence was not the roar of a lion, but the endurance of stone. His crew fought not because they believed they would win, but because they believed in him, and in the fire that had carried them this far, the alien commanders watched in disbelief. They had expected collapse, surrender, despair. Yet what they faced was persistence beyond reason. Human ships that should have fled pressed into battle again and again. Colonists that should have hidden in caves launched desperate attacks. Even when cut down, they struck back with whatever they had. Every fallen ship lit the path for another. Every death fueled the resolve of the living. On the frozen moon of Thalen, alien armies descended to finally wipe out the settlements. They marched across the ice, confident that the humans would be buried beneath their advance. But as the first troops entered the tunnels, explosions tore through the ground, collapsing entire caverns upon them. Farmers and miners emerged from the shadows wielding weapons of stone, metal, and fire, fighting with the desperation of those who had nothing to lose. The battle raged for days, and when the smoke cleared, the humans still stood, bloodied, battered, but alive. On Ardent 3, the rivers of lava became weapons. Engineers redirected flows of molten fire into enemy camps, turning the very planet against the invaders. The aliens fled, shaken not by human weapons but by human audacity. To use a dying world as a sword was madness, but to the humans it was survival, and survival was all they needed. The Council's fleets pushed harder, sending reinforcements doubling their attacks, yet the harder they struck, the fiercer humanity burned. Victories for the humans were small, but each one was a spark that grew into a story. A single ship destroying a cruiser, a handful of settlers holding back an army, a child leading survivors through fire and smoke. These stories carried more power than the Council's weapons, because they carried truth, but the cost was heavy. Entire colonies fell, entire fleets were destroyed, families were broken, countless lives lost. The fire burned bright, but the price of keeping it alive was unbearable. There were nights when even Arik Hale stood in silence, staring at the stars, wondering if the burden was too great, wondering if the fire would consume them before it could spread. Yet, in those moments of doubt, he remembered the faces of the children who lit torches in the darkness, the voices that whispered, "We are still here," and he knew surrender was not an option. The trial of survival was not only a test of strength, it was a test of spirit. The Council had thrown everything at humanity: fleets, armies, storms, hunger, and still the humans endured. They bent but did not break. They fell but always rose again. Their bodies could be broken, their homes destroyed, but their will was iron. Among the alien ranks, fear spread like infection. Soldiers began to refuse raids against human colonies, whispering that to fight humans was to fight death itself. Commanders spoke of humans with both hatred and awe. They called them reckless, insane, cursed, but behind their words was the quiet admission of truth. Humanity could not be broken, and so the galaxy began to change. Slowly, quietly, empires that once mocked humanity began to watch them with new eyes. They did not yet admit respect, but they no longer spoke only of weakness. They spoke of danger, of fire, of endurance that defied all reason. The verdict of the stars was unraveling, not because humanity had conquered, but because humanity had endured. As the trial dragged on, Commander Arik Hale stood once more before his fleet, scarred, diminished, but unbroken. His voice was quiet, steady, as always. "We are not fighting for victory. We are not fighting for conquest. We are fighting to prove the truth. They believed we could not endure. But every breath we take, every step we stand, every fire we light proves them wrong. Hold fast, for our survival is already our victory." And with those words, the fire burned brighter than ever. Humanity had faced the trial of survival, and though they bled, though they suffered, though they nearly shattered, their fire endured, unbroken, unstoppable, unforgettable. The fire. That never dies. The trial of survival had ended, but the galaxy was not the same. The empires had thrown their fleets against humanity. The Council had decreed their extinction, and yet the humans still stood, scarred, bloodied, but unbroken. What was meant to be their final collapse had instead become their greatest testament. And in the silence that followed the storms of war, the galaxy began to whisper the truth that no one could deny any longer. Humanity had endured. In the chambers of the Council, the speaker called for silence. His many eyes scanned the delegates, who once mocked the humans, now too unsettled to laugh. Reports of human victories and survival sat heavy on their tables, too many to ignore, too many to dismiss. For the first time, the Council did not speak of humanity as fragile. They spoke of humanity as dangerous, as unpredictable, as a flame that refused to die. They called for containment, for control, for walls around this rising fire, but in their words there was a tremor of fear, a fear that came not from human weapons, but from the human spirit across. The colonies, the fire continued to burn. The torch fleet had been shattered many times, yet ships still flew, scarred and pieced together, carrying survivors who refused to surrender. Every settlement that had been attacked rebuilt stronger than before. Every child born carried the legacy of those who had fought. Every torch lit in the night sky carried the same message: we are still here. Humanity no longer whispered it as a prayer. They declared it as a truth. Commander Arik Hale returned to the ruins of Raylos 9, where the story of the child in the ashes had first ignited the galaxy's heart. The torch she once held had long since burned away, but in its place the survivors had built a great fire pit, kept alive day and night by those who remembered. Her words, Arik stood before it, his face weathered, his eyes heavy, yet the fire in him still unbroken. Around him stood colonists, soldiers, children, all of them silent, watching, waiting. He raised his voice, not with thunder, but with the calm weight of truth. The council believed our story would end. They believed our fire would fade, but every storm, every battle, every death has proven them wrong. We are still here, and, as long as one flame burns, humanity will never be forgotten. His words carried across the crowd, and in their eyes the fire grew. The galaxy began to change in ways even the council could not control. Among alien worlds, whispers of humanity spread. Some spoke with fear, warning their children never to underestimate a human. Others spoke with awe, telling tales of humans who fought with nothing but spirit. Merchants, soldiers, wanderers carried the stories further, until in every corner of the galaxy, someone spoke the words the humans endured. For humanity, survival was no longer the only goal. They had proven they could endure. They had proven they could resist. Now they looked to the stars, not with fear, but with fire. Colonies began to unite, scattered worlds forming bonds of trade and protection. The Torch Fleet grew once more, stronger, faster, no longer just scraps but symbols of determination. Humanity was no longer a broken people. They were becoming a rising force, and yet, even with their growing strength, they did not forget. On frozen Thalen, fires burned each winter to honor those lost in the storms. On Ardent 3, where lava once threatened to consume everything, the settlers carved monuments into stone, glowing with the heat of the planet itself. On Veyros 7, where sandstorms once shredded their shelters, children now ran free among strongholds built from the same stone that had once scarred them. Everywhere, the fire of memory burned, reminding them of what had been endured and what could never be erased. In time, the very species that once mocked humanity began to study them. They tried to understand how creatures so fragile could outlast storms, famine, and war. They sought to measure the human spirit, to weigh it, to compare it to their own. But no matter how they tried, they failed. For the spirit of humanity could not be measured by bone or skin or years. It was a fire without form, a flame without end. And so the verdict of the stars was rewritten. Humanity was no longer a fragile mistake of evolution. They were the fire that never died. They were the ember that became a blaze, the spark that became a storm. They were the reminder that endurance was not weakness, but the greatest strength. Of all, Arik Hale stood once more beneath the vast expanse of stars, his scars a map of every battle, his silence a weight heavier than words. He whispered into the night, "They believed we could not endure, but our fire will never be forgotten." And though the galaxy was vast, though empires rose and fell, though time itself would try to bury the truth, the fire of humanity burned on, carried in every heart, in every torch, in every star that remembered their name. And so it was written in the memory of the universe. Humanity endured, humanity defied, humanity rose, and their fire never died.
Thank you for joining Eternal Human Spirit, where humanity always rises again.